From the outside looking in, my life was everything I'd ever dreamed of. I was a partner at a top-tier law firm in Manhattan, living in a beautiful apartment overlooking Central Park. My wife, Emma, was the kind of woman who turned heads in any room she entered. Intelligent, funny, and effortlessly elegant. We met 6 years ago at a charity gala, and from the moment our eyes met, I knew she was the one. We got married a year later, and our life together felt like something out of a movie. Weekend getaways to the Hamptons, late-night dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and long conversations about everything and nothing at all. But what I cherished most were the quiet moments, the mornings we'd spend sipping coffee together, the way she'd hum her favorite songs while cooking, and the way she'd smile at me like I was her entire world. So when Emma told me she was pregnant, I thought my happiness had reached its peak. I remember the way her eyes sparkled as she held up the positive test, the way her voice trembled with excitement as she whispered, "We're going to be parents." It felt like the universe had handed me everything I'd ever wanted on a silver platter. For weeks, I floated through life on a cloud of euphoria. We started planning the nursery, arguing over baby names, and imagining what our child would be like. Emma joked that she hoped the baby wouldn't inherit my terrible taste in music, and I teased her about her obsession with 90s rom-coms. Felt perfect, too perfect. But then, something small, almost insignificant, caught my attention. It was just a number, an estimated due date written in tiny, neat handwriting on the corner of a doctor's note. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the more I looked at it, the more something felt off. The date didn't match up with when we'd last been intimate. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Emma had always been honest with me. She'd never given me a reason to doubt her. But once the seed of suspicion was planted, it began to grow, slowly and quietly, like a weed creeping through the cracks of a once strong foundation. By the end of that week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, to go back to the blissful ignorance of the life I thought I had, I knew that once you notice a crack, you can't unsee it. Little did I know, that tiny crack was about to shatter my entire world. The due date haunted me. No matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, it lingered like a shadow, casting doubt over every moment of happiness. I'd stare at the calendar on my phone, counting the weeks over and over, convincing myself I must have made a mistake. But the numbers refused to lie. It wasn't possible. If Emma was truly as far along as the doctor's note suggested, the conception date had to be earlier, before that romantic weekend getaway we'd spent in the Catskills. My mind started spinning, searching for an explanation that didn't involve betrayal. Maybe it was a mistake on the doctor's part. Maybe the date wasn't as exact as it seemed. I told myself I was being irrational, paranoid even. Emma had never given me a reason to doubt her. She wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend, my confidant. We told each other everything, or at least I thought we did. But even as I tried to silence the voice of suspicion in my head, I found myself watching her more closely. That weekend, we were at a dinner party hosted by one of her friends. Emma was radiant, the way she always was in a crowd. She laughed easily, her hand brushing her stomach as she spoke about the baby. But for the first time, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. She avoided my eyes when she talked about the pregnancy. It was subtle, something no one else would have caught. But I did. And once I saw it, I started noticing other little things. The way she'd hesitate before answering certain questions. The way she seemed distracted when we were alone, as though her mind was somewhere else entirely. The tipping point came a few days later. I was working late at the office when my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. It was from a medical lab, a mistake, they said. They'd called the wrong number but wanted to confirm some blood test results for Mrs. Emma Martinez. Martinez. That wasn't Emma's last name. It wasn't even close. I stared at my phone, the message playing over and over in my head. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was just a mix-up. Maybe there was another Emma, and this was all some big coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I didn't tell Emma about the call. Instead, I lay awake beside her, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing as my mind raced. Who was Martinez? And why was my wife's name tied to his? The next morning, I searched her things for answers, a decision I hated myself for even as I made it. Emma had always valued her privacy, and I felt like I was betraying her trust. But the fear gnawing at me was stronger than my guilt. In her purse, tucked beneath her wallet, I found a folded piece of paper. It was a handwritten note. "Thank you for an unforgettable weekend. Love, Alex." My hands shook as I read it, the words blurring together. Unforgettable weekend. Love, Alex. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The perfect life I'd built with Emma was crumbling, and I didn't even know where to begin picking up the pieces. But one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore the cracks anymore. I couldn't get the name Alex out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that note, the neat, deliberate handwriting, the word love written with a casual intimacy that wasn't mine to claim. It was like a splinter lodged deep in my mind, impossible to ignore. That evening, I sat across from Emma at dinner, watching her laugh at some silly story she was telling about her day. She looked so at ease, so radiant, and for a moment, I felt like I was going insane. Could I really confront her with nothing but a folded note and a few suspicious dates? But when I tried to push it down, the doubts only grew louder. The voicemail, the due date, the note from Alex, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. The next day, my suspicions deepened when I checked the mail. In the pile of bills and promotional flyers was an envelope addressed to Emma. The return address was unfamiliar, but the name on it made my stomach churn. Alex Martinez. I held the envelope in my hands, frozen. It was one thing to find a note tucked away in her purse. But this, a letter addressed to her, delivered to our home? It was proof that Alex wasn't just a fleeting name, he was a presence in her life. My first instinct was to open it, to tear it apart and devour whatever secrets it held. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the guilt, the part of me that still clung to the belief that there had to be an explanation. Or maybe I was just afraid of what I'd find. Instead, I left the letter where it was, carefully placing it on the counter as though touching it too much would make it explode. That night, I watched Emma's reaction when she found it. She glanced at the envelope and froze, her smile faltering for just a second. "Who's Alex Martinez?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Emma's face softened into confusion. Too much confusion. "I don't know. Maybe it's junk mail." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. She didn't open the letter right away, instead slipping it into her handbag like it was no big deal. But I could see the tension in her movements, the way she avoided looking at me directly. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep, I went back to her handbag. My hands trembled as I reached inside, pulling out the letter. I carefully opened the envelope, making sure not to leave any sign it had been tampered with. Inside was a single page, a handwritten letter from Alex. "Emma, I can't stop thinking about the time we spent together. You've been quiet lately, and I'm starting to worry. Please, tell me what's going on. Are we still okay? I miss you. Always, Alex." I sat there in the dark, the letter crumpled in my hands. He missed her. He wanted to know if they were okay. That could only mean one thing. Their relationship wasn't in the past. It was ongoing. My chest felt like it was caving in. The woman I had built my life around, the woman carrying what I thought was my child, was lying to me. And this wasn't just some fleeting mistake. It was deeper, more deliberate. I put the letter back exactly as I'd found it, my mind racing. Confronting her felt inevitable, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed more. More proof, more answers. Something I could use to unravel the tangled web of lies she'd spun around me. For now, I would wait. I would watch. And I would find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I woke up the next morning with a single thought. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The letter had made it clear. There was another man, and he wasn't just a shadow of the past. Alex Martinez was very much present in Emma's life, and I needed to find out who he was and how deep this betrayal ran. I started small, combing through Emma's social media. She wasn't overly active, but there were a few photos from months ago that stood out to me now. One was of her at a coffee shop downtown, smiling at the camera with a caption that read, "A little escape from the chaos." At the time, it seemed innocent, but now I noticed the details. The empty chair across from her, the second coffee cup partially cropped out of the frame. Next, I went through her calendar. She'd always been meticulous about keeping track of appointments, and while most of it was routine yoga classes, doctor's visits, there were a few entries that caught my eye. Dates marked simply as meeting or lunch, with no further explanation. One particular entry stood out: Lunch, Art District. It was from 2 months ago, during a week when I'd been swamped with work and barely had time to see her. The Art District wasn't a place we usually went. It was on the other side of the city, filled with boutique galleries and trendy cafes. That was my first lead. That afternoon, I drove to the Art District, parking near the address Emma had written in her calendar. It was a small cafe tucked between 2 galleries, the kind of place that catered to the creative crowd. I went inside, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window watching. The staff didn't seem to recognize me, which wasn't surprising. I'd never been here before. But when I asked casually if they'd seen a woman fitting Emma's description, they hesitated. One of the baristas, a young guy with a hipster beard, nodded slowly. "Yeah, she comes in sometimes," he said. "Usually with this guy. Dark hair, kinda tall. They always sit over there." He pointed to a corner booth, tucked away from the main seating area. My stomach churned. I tried to keep my expression neutral as I thanked him and left, but inside, I was unraveling. She had been here with Alex, more than once, if the barista's memory was accurate. When I got home, Emma greeted me with a smile, her voice cheerful as she asked about my day. I tried to act normal, but every word she said felt like another twist of the knife. How could she stand there, so calm, so composed, while carrying on this double life? That night, I made a decision. If I was going to confront Emma, I needed undeniable proof. Something she couldn't explain away with a well-crafted excuse. And for that, I needed help. The next morning, I called an old acquaintance, a private investigator named Greg, who specialized in uncovering infidelities. We'd worked together on a case years ago, and I knew he was good at what he did. When I explained my situation, he didn't sound surprised. "This kind of thing happens more than you'd think," he said. "People aren't as good at hiding their secrets as they like to believe. Give me a week, and I'll find out everything you need to know." I hesitated before agreeing. It felt like crossing a line, like admitting I couldn't fix this on my own. But I was desperate. I needed answers, and Greg was my best chance at getting them. That week was one of the longest of my life. Every time Emma left the house, I wondered where she was going, who she was meeting. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be Greg with an update. When the call finally came, I wasn't ready for what he told me. "I've got something," Greg said. "You're not going to like it." Greg met me in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one would think to look for someone having a life-altering conversation. When he slid the manila folder across the table, I felt my heart pound so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. "Everything's in here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Dates, times, photos. I tracked her movements over the past week, like you asked. It's conclusive." I stared at the folder for a moment, as if opening it would unleash some irreversible chain of events. Greg didn't push me, letting me sit with my thoughts. Finally, I forced myself to lift the flap. The first photo hit me like a punch to the gut. There was Emma, sitting at the same corner booth in the Art District Cafe. Across from her was a man I didn't recognize, his dark hair messy in a way that seemed deliberate. He was leaning forward, smiling at her like she was the only person in the world. And Emma, she was smiling back. It wasn't just any smile. It was the smile she used to give me, the one that said she felt safe, adored, understood. Seeing it directed at someone else was like watching her hand my heart over to a stranger. I flipped through the photos, each one worse than the last. Them walking out of the cafe together, her arm brushing against his. A photo of them sitting on a park bench, his hand on hers. And finally, a grainy but unmistakable shot of them entering a boutique hotel. I clenched my fists so tightly the edges of the folder dug into my skin. I wanted to tell myself there was some other explanation, that maybe these were all innocent moments taken out of context. But deep down, I knew better. Greg cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "There's more," he said. "I dug into this guy, Alex Martinez. Turns out he's a freelance photographer. Travels a lot, works with high-profile clients. He's based in LA but has been spending a lot of time in New York recently. No idea how they met, but..." He hesitated. "It's serious. This isn't just a fling." "Serious?" My voice cracked. "What does that mean?" Greg leaned back, his expression carefully neutral. "It means they've been seeing each other for at least 6 months, based on what I've found. Could be longer. And..." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "From the way they interact, it's more than just physical. There's an emotional connection there." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. 6 months. That was before Emma had even told me she was pregnant. I shoved the folder back toward Greg, unable to look at it anymore. "What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg sighed. "That's up to you. Some people confront their partner, try to work it out. Others, well, they walk away. But whatever you decide, you needed to know the truth. That's why you hired me." The ride home was a blur. The streets of Manhattan passed by in a haze, the sound of car horns and chatter muffled like I was underwater. When I got home, Emma was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up and smiled at me, the same smile that was now burned into my memory from those photos. "Hey," she said, her voice warm. "How was your day?" I stared at her, the words rising in my throat like bile. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to throw the photos down in front of her and watch her try to explain them away. But instead I said, "Fine. Just tired." She nodded and went back to her book, completely unaware that the walls were closing in around her. Around us. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the folder sitting on the nightstand like a bomb waiting to go off. I didn't know what my next move would be, but one thing was clear. The life I thought I had was gone. The only question left was whether I could salvage the pieces, or if I even wanted to. The folder sat on my desk for 2 more days, an unspoken weight pressing down on every moment I spent in that house. I couldn't look at Emma without the images flashing through my mind. Her smile, his hand on hers, the hotel door closing behind them. Every word she spoke sounded rehearsed. Every kiss felt hollow. On the 3rd night, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to confront her. I couldn't let the lies fester any longer, tearing apart what little remained of my sanity. She was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for dinner. It was such a domestic, peaceful scene, so at odds with the chaos swirling inside me, that it almost stopped me in my tracks. But then I thought of Alex, and the resolve hardened in my chest. "Emma," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned, a faint crease of concern forming on her brow. "Yeah." I didn't say anything at first. I just placed the folder on the counter between us, the sound of it hitting the surface loud in the quiet room. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Open it," I said, crossing my arms to keep my hands from trembling. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the flap. For a moment I thought she might refuse, but then she opened it, pulling out the photos and flipping through them one by one. Her face drained of color. "I can explain," she started, but her voice wavered, betraying her. "Can you?" I shot back, my anger finally breaking through. "Explain the cafe? The park? The hotel? Tell me, Emma, what part of this am I supposed to understand?" She set the photos down, her hands shaking. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "Alex is. He's just someone I don't," I interrupted, slamming my hand on the counter. "Don't you dare tell me he's just someone. I've seen the way you look at him, Emma. I've seen the notes, the letters. Don't insult me by pretending this is nothing." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But it wasn't enough to drown out the anger. "I never wanted it to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It just did. It just did? I repeated, incredulous. That's your excuse? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with him, and all you can say is it just did? She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said. I swear I didn't. I love you. But what? I demanded. You love him too? Is that it? Her silence was answer enough. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone in the world, and realized she was a stranger to me now. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about Alex. It was about the life we'd built together, the trust she'd shattered. What about the baby? I asked, my voice cracking. Is it even mine? Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. Of course it's yours, she said, the words coming out too quickly, too forcefully. How could you even ask that? Because the dates don't add up, I said coldly. Because I don't know what to believe anymore. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she just stood there, tears streaming down her face, as the silence between us grew heavier and heavier. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, into the cool night air. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there. Not with her, not with the weight of everything I'd just learned pressing down on me. As I walked down the empty streets, one thought echoed in my mind. Nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't go back that night. I wandered aimlessly through the streets, the city lights blurring as my mind raced. The confrontation had left me hollow, yet somehow the pain felt sharper now, like an exposed nerve. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, a place with flickering neon signs and the smell of stale cigarettes. It wasn't much, but it was somewhere I could be alone to process what had happened. As I sat on the lumpy bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I realized I wasn't just angry, I was lost. When had we started falling apart? Was it before Alex came into the picture? Or was he the symptom of something deeper, something I'd been too blind to see? I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I might have missed. The late nights at work, the distant glances, the forced smiles. Had I ignored them because it was easier to believe we were fine? The next morning, I woke to a flood of missed calls and text messages from Emma. The texts ranged from tearful apologies to desperate pleas for me to come home. But there was one message that stood out. Please, can we talk? I'll tell you everything. I wanted to ignore her, to make her feel even a fraction of the hurt she'd caused me. But the truth was I needed answers. I needed to know the full story, no matter how much it hurt. When I walked back into the house later that day, Emma was waiting for me. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The air between us was thick with tension, each of us waiting for the other to speak. You said you'd tell me everything, I said, breaking the silence. So start talking. She nodded, taking a deep breath. I met Alex about a year ago, she began, her voice trembling. It was at a gallery opening in the art district. I didn't plan for anything to happen, we just started talking, and, I don't know, it felt easy, like we understood each other. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to interrupt. She needed to say this, and I needed to hear it. At first, it was just conversations, she continued. He'd text me, and I'd respond. Felt harmless. But then it became more. Coffee dates, lunches. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a friendship. But I was lying to myself. And the hotel? I asked, my voice cold. She flinched as if I'd struck her. It only happened once, she said, barely above a whisper. I swear, it only happened once. I regretted it immediately, but by then, I'd already crossed the line. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of the woman I used to trust. Why? I asked. Why wasn't I enough? Her lips trembled. It wasn't about you, she said. It was about me. I felt lost, like I didn't know who I was anymore. And Alex, he made me feel alive again, like I was someone worth noticing. But it was a mistake, Nathan. A terrible mistake. I wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that this was just a horrible chapter in our story that we could somehow move past. But then I thought of the baby, the question that still lingered like a dark cloud over everything. "And the baby?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She looked me in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "It's yours, Nathan," she said. "I know the dates don't add up perfectly, but I swear to you, it's yours." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But after everything she'd admitted, trust felt like a distant memory, something I couldn't reach no matter how hard I tried. "I don't know if I can do this, Emma," I said finally, the weight of the words almost too much to bear. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "I understand," she whispered. "But please, give me a chance to prove to you that I love you, that I want us to work." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, the sound of her sobs echoing behind me. That night, I slept on the couch, my mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Love, anger, betrayal, and a small, flickering ember of hope. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The life we'd built together was gone. The only question now was whether we could build something new, or if we'd both be better off letting it all crumble to dust. The next few days passed in a haze of silence. Emma stayed in the bedroom most of the time, leaving only to eat or to try and talk to me. I avoided her, unable to look at her without feeling the weight of everything she'd confessed. But I couldn't avoid the question that haunted me every second. Was the baby mine? I decided I needed answers, and not just from her. I scheduled an appointment for a prenatal paternity test. It felt cold and clinical, but I had no other choice. Emma agreed without hesitation, her expression filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. At the clinic, the atmosphere was sterile, the walls painted in shades of beige meant to soothe. It didn't work. The nurse explained the procedure, her voice gentle but distant, as if she could sense the tension between us. Emma sat silently, her hands folded over her stomach, her face pale. As they drew her blood, I couldn't help but glance at her. For a moment, she looked so fragile, so vulnerable, that I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered Alex, the photos, the lies, and the guilt was replaced by a cold, steely resolve. The doctor reassured us the results would take about a week. A week. 7 days of waiting, of wondering, of questioning everything. Felt like a lifetime. When we got home, Emma tried to reach out to me. "Nathan," she said softly, her voice breaking, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I meant what I said. The baby is yours. I just need you to trust me." "Trust you?" I snapped, my anger flaring. "You've been lying to me for months, Emma. How am I supposed to trust you now?" Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I'm begging you to try." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Instead, I left the room, letting the silence between us stretch even further. That night, as I lay awake on the couch, staring at the dark ceiling, I realized something. The truth would come, one way or another. And when it did, it would either shatter what little remained of our life together, or it would be the first step toward rebuilding it. For now, all I could do was wait. The week felt endless. Every tick of the clock, every passing day, stretched my nerves tighter. Emma kept her distance, sensing the fragile state of my emotions, and I spent most of my time out of the house, driving aimlessly or sitting in coffee shops where no one knew me. The waiting was unbearable. Finally, the call came. I stared at the screen, the number from the clinic glowing like a threat. My hands were clammy as I picked up, my voice barely steady. "Mr. Harper?" The voice on the other end said. It was the doctor, calm, professional, detached. "We've completed the prenatal paternity test." I gripped the edge of the table, bracing myself. "And the results confirm that you are the biological father of the child." The words hit me like a wave, relief and confusion crashing into each other. I thanked the doctor mechanically, my voice distant, and hung up. I sat there for a long moment, staring at nothing. The baby was mine. Despite everything, despite the lies and betrayal, Emma had told the truth about this one thing. When I walked back into the house, Emma was sitting in the living room, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked up at me, her eyes red and hopeful. "Well?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's mine," I said simply. She exhaled sharply, tears streaming down her face. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you it was yours." I nodded, but the relief didn't come as easily as I thought it would. The baby was mine, yes, but the damage was still there, raw and unhealed. "This doesn't change what you did," I said, my voice firm. "You lied to me, Emma. You betrayed me. The baby being mine doesn't erase that." "I know," she said quickly, her hands reaching for mine. "But it's a start, isn't it? Please, Nathan, let me prove to you that I can be better, that we can get through this." I pulled my hands away, the hurt still too fresh. "I don't know if we can," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can." Her face fell, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, her tears silent now. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly. "Whatever you need." For the first time in days, I saw a glimmer of sincerity in her eyes, a desperation that felt real. But whether it was enough, I still didn't know. I walked away, retreating to the bedroom, leaving her alone with her thoughts. For now, I needed space to think, to feel, to decide what kind of future I wanted for myself, for her, for the baby. The truth had finally come to light, but the path forward was still shrouded in uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, and Emma did everything she could to show me she was sorry. She made breakfast, cleaned the house, even went to therapy on her own. But every time I looked at her, I still saw the betrayal, and the baby, our baby, felt like a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. One evening, she sat down across from me, her voice soft but firm. "Nathan, I'm asking you to make a choice. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But I need you to decide. Do you want to try again? Or is it over?" I didn't answer immediately. My heart was heavy, and my mind was clouded with doubts. Could I forgive her? Could I really rebuild what we had? Finally, I spoke. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forget what you did, but I'm not ready to walk away yet." She looked at me, searching my face for any sign of hope. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, her voice trembling. "One day at a time." But as I watched her leave the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard we tried, we would never go back to who we once were. The months that followed were quiet. The house wasn't filled with the same laughter and warmth anymore. Emma and I existed together, but it was more out of routine than love. We spoke less, avoided eye contact more, and every interaction seemed to carry an undercurrent of unresolved tension. The baby was born, a little boy, with Emma's eyes and my stubborn chin. Holding him for the first time, I realized that despite everything, he was my son. I couldn't deny that, no matter how broken we were. But I also realized something else. I couldn't live in this uncertainty forever. I couldn't keep pretending that the love we had before was enough to heal the wounds that had been carved so deep. One night, I stood at the door, ready to leave for good. I packed a bag, kissed my son's forehead, and told Emma I needed to go. She didn't fight me. She knew deep down that we had both failed each other. "I'm sorry, Nathan," she said softly, her voice raw. "I'll always love you." "I know," I whispered, "but I can't keep holding on to something that's already fallen apart." And with that, I left. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I had to move forward. For me, for my son. I hope you found the journey through this story compelling. It's a tough one to tell, but sometimes life doesn't offer easy answers. What would you have done in Nathan's shoes? Leave a comment and share your thoughts.